Arity had not been asleep. She had been lying under her knitted coverlet staring up at the ceiling. It was an interesting ceiling. Pod had built Arity's bedroom out of 2 cigar boxes, and on the ceiling lovely painted ladies dressed in swirls of chiffon blew long trumpets against a background of blue sky. Below there were feathery palm trees and small white houses set about a square. It was a glamorous scene, above all by candlelight, but tonight Arity had stared without seeing. The wood of a cigar box is thin, and Arity, lying straight and still under the quilt, had heard the rise and fall of worried voices. She had heard her own name. She had heard Homily exclaim, "Nuts and berries, that's what they eat!" And she had heard, after a while, the heartfelt cry of, "What shall we do?" So when Homily appeared beside her bed, she wrapped herself obediently in her quilt, and padding in her bare feet along the dusty passage, she joined her parents in the warmth of the kitchen. Crouched on her little stool, she sat clasping her knees, shivering a little, and looking from one face to another. Homily came beside her, and kneeling on the floor, she placed an arm round Arity's skinny shoulders. "Arity," she said gravely, "you know about upstairs?" "What about it?" asked Arity. "You know there are 2 giants?" "Yes," said Arity, "Great Aunt Sophie and Mrs. Driver." "That's right," said Homily, "and Cranfurl in the garden." She laid a roughened hand on Arity's clasped ones. "You know about Uncle Hendry?" Arity thought a while. "He went abroad?" she said. "Emigrated," corrected Homily, "to the other side of the world, with Aunt Loopy and all the children, to a badger's set, a hole in a bank under a hawthorn ledge. Now why do you think he did this?" "Oh," said Arity, her face alight, "to be out of doors, to lie in the sun, to run in the grass, to swing on twigs like the birds do, or to suck honey." "Nonsense, Arity!" exclaimed Homily sharply. "That's a nasty habit, and your Uncle Henry's a rheumatic sort of man. He emigrated," she went on, stressing the word, "because he was seen." "Oh," said Arity. "He was seen on the 23rd of April, 1892, by Rosa Pickhatchet, on the drawing-room mantelpiece. Of all places," she added suddenly in a wondering aside. "Oh," said Arity, "I have never heard, nor no one has ever seen fit to tell why he went on the drawing-room mantelpiece in the first place. There's nothing on it, your father assures me, which cannot be seen from the floor, or by standing sideways on the handle of the bureau and steadying yourself on the key. That's what your father does if he ever goes into the drawing-room." "They said it was a liver pill," put in Pod. "How do you mean?" asked Homily, startled. "A liver pill for Loopy," Pod spoke wearily. "Someone started a rumor," he went on, "that there were liver pills on the drawing-room mantelpiece." "Oh," said Homily, and looked thoughtful. "I never heard that. All the same," she exclaimed, "it was stupid and foolhardy. There's no way down except by the bedpool. She dusted him, they say, with a feather duster, and he stood so still alongside a cupid that she might never have noticed him if he hadn't sneezed. She was new, you see, and didn't know the ornaments. We heard her screeching right here under the kitchen, and they could never get her to clean anything much after that. Wasn't chairs or tables. Least of all the tiger skin rug." "I don't hardly never bother with the drawing room," said Pod. "Everything's got its place like, and they see what goes. There might be a little something left on the table or down the side of a chair, but not without there's been company. And there never is no company. Not for the last 10 or 12 year. Sitting here in this chair, I can tell you by heart every blessed thing that's in that drawing room, working round from the cabinet by the window to the—" "There's a mint of things in that cabinet," interrupted Homily. "Solid silver, some of them. A solid silver violin they got there, strings and all, just right for our Arity." "What's the good," asked Pod, "of things behind glass? Couldn't you break it? Suggested Arity. Just a corner, just a little tap, just a... Her voice faltered as she saw the shocked amazement on her father's face. Listen here, Arity, began Homily angrily, and then she controlled herself and patted Arity's clasped hands. She don't know much about borrowing, she explained to Pod. You can't blame her. She turned again to Arity. Borrowing's a skilled job, an art like. Of all the families who've been in this house, there's only us left. And do you know for why? Because your father, Arity, is the best borrower that's been known in these parts since, well, before your granddad's time. Even your Aunt Loopy admitted that much. When he was younger, I've seen your father walk the length of a laid dinner table after the gong was rung, taking a nut or sweet from every dish, and down by a fold in the tablecloth as the first people came in at the door. He'd do it just for fun, wouldn't you, Pod? Pod smiled wanly. There wasn't no sense in it, he said. Maybe, said Homily, but you did it. Who else would dare? I were younger then, said Pod. He sighed and turned to Arity. You don't break things, lass. That's not the way to do it. That's not borrowing. We were rich then, said Homily. Oh, we did have some lovely things. You were only a tot, Arity, and wouldn't remember. We had a whole suite of walnut furniture out of the doll's house, and a set of wine glasses in green glass, and a musical snuff box. And the cousins would come and we'd have parties. Do you remember, Pod? Not only the cousins. The harpsichords came. Everybody came, except those overmantels from the morning room. And we'd dance, and the young people would sit out by the grating. 3 tunes that Snuff-Box played, Clementine, God Save the Queen, and the Post-Chaise Gallop. We were the envy of everybody, even the overmantels. Who were the overmantels? Asked Arity. Oh, you must have heard me talk of the overmantels, exclaimed Homily. That stuck-up lot who lived in the wall high up among the lath and plaster behind the mantelpiece in the morning room. And a queer lot they were. The men smoked all the time because the tobacco jars were kept there, and they'd climb about and in and out of the carvings of the overmantel, sliding down pillars and showing off. The women were a conceited lot, too, always admiring themselves in all those bits of overmantel looking glass. They never asked anyone up there, and I, for one, never wanted to go. I've no head for heights, and your father never liked the men. He's always lived steady, your father has, and not only the tobacco jars, but the whiskey decanters, too, were kept in the morning room, and they say those overmantel men would suck up the dregs in the glasses through those quill pipe cleaners they keep there on the mantelpiece. I don't know whether it's true, but they do say that those overmantel men used to have a party every Tuesday after the bailiff had been to talk business in the morning room. Laid out they'd be, dead drunk, or so the story goes, on the green plush tablecloth, all among the tin boxes and the account books. Now, Homily, protested Pod, who did not like gossip. I never seed 'em. But you wouldn't put it past 'em, Pod. You said yourself when I married you not to call on the overmantels. They lived so high, said Pod, that's all. Well, they were a lazy lot, that much you can't deny. They never had no kind of home life, kept themselves warm in winter by the heat of the morning room fire, and ate nothing but breakfast food. Breakfast, of course, was the only meal served in the morning room. What happened to them? Asked Arity. Well, when the master died and she took to her bed, there was no more use for the morning room, so the overmantels had to go. What else could they do? No food, no fire. It's a bitter cold room in winter. And the harpsichords? Asked Arity. Homily looked thoughtful. Well, they were different. I'm not saying they weren't stuck up too, because they were. Your Aunt Loopy, who married your Uncle Herondry, was a harpsichord by marriage, and we all know the airs she gave herself. Now, Homily, began Pod. Well, she'd no right to. She was only a rain pipe from the stables before she married harpsichord. Didn't she marry Uncle Hendry? Asked Arity. Yes, later. She was a widow with 2 children, and he was a widower with 3. It's no good looking at me like that, Pod. You can't deny she took it out of poor Hendry. She thought it was a come down to marry a clock. Why? Asked Arity. Because we clocks live under the kitchen, that's why. Because we don't talk fancy grammar and eat anchovy toast. But to live under the kitchen doesn't say we aren't educated. The clocks are just as old a family as the harpsichords. You remember that, Arity, and don't let anyone tell you different. Your grandfather could count and write down the numbers up to, what was it, Pod? 57, said Pod. There, said Homily, 57. And your father can count, as you know, Arity. He can count and write down the numbers on as far as it goes. How far does it go, Pod? Close on 1,000, said Pod. There, exclaimed Homily. And he knows the alphabet because he taught you, Arity, didn't he? And he would have been able to read, wouldn't you, Pod, if he hadn't started to borrowing so young? Your Uncle Hendry and your father had to go out borrowing at 13. Your age, Arity. Think of it. But I should like, began Arity. So he didn't have your advantages, went on Homily breathlessly. And just because the harpsichords lived in the drawing room, they moved in there, in 1837, to a hole in the wainscot just behind where the harpsichord used to stand, if ever there was one, which I doubt, and were really a family called Linen Press, or some such name, and changed it to harpsichord. What did they live on? Asked Arity in the drawing room. Afternoon tea, said Homily. Nothing but afternoon tea. No wonder the children grew up peaky. Of course, in the old days it was better, muffins and crumpets and such, and good rich cake and jams and jellies. And there was one old harpsichord who could remember syllabub of an evening. But they had to do their borrowing in such a rush, poor things. On the wet days when human beings sat all afternoon in the drawing room, the tea would be brought in and taken away again without a chance of the harpsichords getting near it, and on fine days it might be taken out into the garden. Loopy has told me that, sometimes, there were days and days when they lived on crumbs and on water out of the flower vases, so you can't be too hard on them. Their only comfort, poor things, was to show off a bit and wear evening dress and talk like ladies and gentlemen. Did you ever hear your Aunt Loopy talk? Yes, no, I can't remember. Oh, you should have heard her say parquet. That's the stuff the drawing room floor's made of. Parquet, parquet, she'd say. Oh, it was lovely. Come to think of it, your Aunt Loopy was the most stuck up of them all. Arity's shivering, said Pod. We didn't get the little maid up to talk about Aunt Loopy. Nor we did, cried Homily, suddenly contrite. You should have stopped me, Pod. There, my lamb, tuck this quilt right round you, and I'll get you a nice drop of piping hot soup. And yet, said Pod, as Homily, fussing at the stove, ladled soup into the teacup. We did, in a way. Did what? Asked Homily. Get her here to talk about Aunt Loopy. Aunt Loopy, Uncle Hendry, and he paused. Eglatina. Let her drink up her soup first, said Homily. There's no call for her to stop drinking, said Pod.